1944 was not just another year in the Second World War. It was the year the world began to realize that the end was approaching, though no one yet knew what shape that end would take, or how many lives it would still consume before silence finally replaced the thunder of artillery. Across Europe, cities lay shattered like broken bones. Fields were scarred by tank tracks and shell craters, and millions of people moved like ghosts between ruins, carrying memories heavier than any suitcase. Germany, once roaring with confidence and iron certainty, was now bleeding on every front, and within that collapse existed stories so strange, so human, and so morally complex that history textbooks often reduce them to footnotes or erase them entirely. One of those stories began not on a battlefield, but in a prisoner transport, carrying German women across the Atlantic Ocean toward a fate none of them could have imagined. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They carried no rifles, commanded no divisions, and had not stormed beaches or flown bombers. They were nurses, radio operators, clerks, and auxiliary medical staff, women trained to heal, to organize, to support life amid destruction. Captured during the final chaotic phases of the war in Europe, these women expected the same fate as millions of others who fell into enemy hands. Hunger, humiliation, cold barracks, shouted orders, and a slow erosion of dignity. Every rumor they had heard painted the Americans as either brutal, jailers or smug conquerors, men who would treat them not as professionals, not as women, but as enemies to be broken and displayed as trophies of victory. What awaited them instead was something so unexpected that many of them thought it was a trick. As the ships reached American shores and the women were processed into prisoner of war camps scattered across the United States, the first cracks appeared in everything they believed about captivity. There were no beatings during intake, no screaming guards, no starvation rations pushed across filthy tables. Instead, there were clean uniforms, medical checkups conducted with calm professionalism, and food that, shockingly, was not only sufficient, but warm. For women who had spent months tending to shattered bodies and collapsing German hospitals, this alone felt unreal. But the real shock came later, in the words spoken to them by American officers and camp administrators, words that would stay with many of them for the rest of their lives. You're still nurses, not enemy women, not Nazi auxiliaries, not spoils of war, still nurses. Those words cut deeper than any insult ever could, because they acknowledged something the war had tried to erase: their identity as healers, as professionals sworn to preserve life regardless of uniform or flag. In a conflict defined by dehumanization, the Americans, surprisingly, chose recognition. The camps themselves felt like contradictions, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Yes, but inside there were libraries, educational programs, medical facilities, and opportunities to continue practicing their skills. American military doctors, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the war effort, realized something pragmatic and profoundly human at the same time. Trained nurses were valuable, even if they wore the wrong uniform yesterday, under supervision. Many of these German women were allowed to assist in medical wards, care for fellow prisoners, and in some cases even help treat American personnel. The very idea would have been unthinkable on the Eastern Front or within the collapsing Reich, where suspicion ruled and mercy was seen as weakness. Life inside the American prisoner of war camp settled into a rhythm that felt almost dangerous in its normality, because normality itself had become a forbidden luxury during the war years. The German women learned the schedules quickly. Roll calls conducted without shouting, meals served at consistent times, work assignments explained rather than barked as commands. For many of them, this predictability was more unsettling than chaos, because it allowed the mind to wander back to memories they had spent years suppressing: bombed hospitals, amputations performed under candlelight, dying soldiers gripping their hands and whispering for mothers or wives who would never arrive. In America, the nights were quiet. Too quiet. No sirens, no distant artillery, no collapsing walls. Silence, once rare, now pressed heavily on their thoughts, forcing reflection instead of survival. The Americans, for their part, observed the women with a mixture of curiosity and cautious respect. These were not the caricatures of enemy womanhood that propaganda posters had shown. They were disciplined, educated, and emotionally scarred professionals who had spent the war saving lives, rather than taking them. Camp doctors quickly realized that many of the German nurses were exceptionally well trained, especially in trauma care, infection control, and emergency procedures refined under extreme pressure. Slowly, carefully, permissions expanded. The women were allowed to organize infirmaries within the camps, to establish proper triage systems, and to teach first aid techniques to orderlies. Each small allowance felt like a crack in the rigid wall that was supposed to separate captor from captive. Yet beneath the surface, conflict simmered. Some American soldiers struggled to reconcile their personal losses with the polite faces behind the wire. Brothers had died in Normandy. Fathers were missing in Italy. Friends lay buried in the Pacific. To see German women treated with courtesy felt, to some, like betrayal. But the military command held firm. Discipline applied to everyone. Respect was non-negotiable, and slowly, resistance softened into reluctant acceptance. Familiarity did what ideology could not. It humanized the enemy. Yes, but inside there were libraries, educational programs, medical facilities, and opportunities to continue practicing their skills. American military doctors, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the war effort, realized something pragmatic and profoundly human at the same time. Trained nurses were valuable, even if they wore the wrong uniform yesterday, under supervision. Many of these German women were allowed to assist in medical wards, care for fellow prisoners, and in some cases even help treat American personnel. The very idea would have been unthinkable on the Eastern Front or within the collapsing Reich, where suspicion ruled and mercy was seen as weakness. Life inside the American prisoner of war camp settled into a rhythm that felt almost dangerous in its normality, because normality itself had become a forbidden luxury during the war years. The German women learned the schedules quickly. Roll calls conducted without shouting, meals served at consistent times, work assignments explained rather than barked as commands. For many of them, this predictability was more unsettling than chaos, because it allowed the mind to wander back to memories they had spent years suppressing: bombed hospitals, amputations performed under candlelight, dying soldiers gripping their hands and whispering for mothers or wives who would never arrive. In America, the nights were quiet. Too quiet. No sirens, no distant artillery, no collapsing walls. Silence, once rare, now pressed heavily on their thoughts, forcing reflection instead of survival. The Americans, for their part, observed the women with a mixture of curiosity and cautious respect. These were not the caricatures of enemy womanhood that propaganda posters had shown. They were disciplined, educated, and emotionally scarred professionals who had spent the war saving lives rather than taking them. Camp doctors quickly realized that many of the German nurses were exceptionally well trained, especially in trauma care, infection control, and emergency procedures refined under extreme pressure. Slowly, carefully, permissions expanded. The women were allowed to organize infirmaries within the camps, to establish proper triage systems, and to teach first aid techniques to orderlies. Each small allowance felt like a crack in the rigid wall that was supposed to separate captor from captive. Yet beneath the surface, conflict simmered. Some American soldiers struggled to reconcile their personal losses with the polite faces behind the wire. Brothers had died in Normandy. Fathers were missing in Italy. Friends lay buried in the Pacific. To see German women treated with courtesy felt, to some, like betrayal. But the military command held firm. Discipline applied to everyone. Respect was non-negotiable, and slowly, resistance softened into reluctant acceptance. Familiarity did what ideology could not. It humanized the enemy. Conversations began cautiously, often limited to professional topics at first. Medical terminology became a neutral language where politics could not intrude. A wound was a wound, infection was infection, pain was universal. Over time, these conversations expanded. Questions were asked quietly, sometimes hesitantly. What had Germany been like before the war? Did they believe everything they had been told? What did they think would happen afterward? The women answered honestly when they could, carefully when they could not. Many admitted that they no longer knew what to believe. Years of propaganda collapsed when confronted with reality, and the certainty that once fueled loyalty gave way to exhaustion and doubt. Letters from home, when they arrived, often carried devastating news. Cities destroyed, families displaced, husbands dead or missing. Some women learned that the hospitals they had trained in no longer existed. Others discovered that parents had vanished during bombings or evacuations. The Americans allowed these letters, fully aware of the emotional toll they carried, believing that truth, however painful, was better than ignorance. Grief unfolded differently here. There was no screaming, no public breakdowns. Instead, sorrow moved quietly through the barracks, shared in long conversations after lights out, carried in the eyes during morning roll call. In those moments, the kindness of captivity became both comfort and cruelty, because it gave them the space to feel everything they had postponed. There were moments of deep contradiction. On holidays, some camps permitted modest celebrations, music, shared meals, even carefully supervised social gatherings. To sing songs or eat special food while knowing Europe was still bleeding felt wrong to many of the women, and yet refusing these moments felt like denying their own humanity. The Americans did not force participation. Choice itself became another unexpected gift. You could say no, you could step away, you could mourn privately without punishment. For women raised under a system where refusal was dangerous, this freedom was disorienting. As the war dragged toward its inevitable conclusion, rumors swept through the camps faster than official announcements. Allied advances, the fall of cities, whispers of camps discovered in Europe. Stories so horrifying that they were initially dismissed as exaggerations. When confirmation came, fragmented, incomplete, but undeniable, the psychological ground shifted. Some women broke down entirely, struggling to reconcile their role as caregivers with the crimes committed under the banner they had served. Others reacted with numb denial, clinging to the belief that they could not be held responsible for actions they neither ordered nor witnessed. The Americans again chose restraint. There were no lectures, no accusations shouted across fences. History, they believed, would deliver judgment soon enough. The phrase, "you're still nurses," took on new weight during this period. It was no longer just reassurance, it became responsibility. Healing was no longer limited to bodies. It extended to conscience. Some of the women volunteered to assist in caring for newly arrived prisoners in worse condition, sharing food, supplies, and emotional support. In doing so, they reclaimed a sense of purpose that the collapse of their nation had stolen. They could not undo the past, but they could still act in the present. By the time Germany officially surrendered, the camps did not erupt in celebration. There were no cheers from the prisoners, no visible triumph from the guards. Instead, there was a heavy collective pause. The war was over, but nothing felt resolved. Defeat carried fear, fear of return, fear of judgment, fear of a homeland that might no longer feel like home. The Americans informed the women that repatriation would come, but not immediately. Europe was shattered. Transportation was limited. Stability had to be rebuilt before anyone could be sent back. Those waiting months became a strange afterword to the war itself. Prisoners and guards, no longer defined by active conflict, existed in an uneasy in-between. Bonds formed that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. Mutual respect, quiet friendships, professional admiration. No illusions of equality existed, but the hostility had drained away, replaced by something harder to define and impossible to erase. And still, every morning roll call happened. Every evening lights went out. The barbed wire remained. Because even in mercy, captivity was captivity. Time inside the camps began to stretch in unnatural ways, no longer measured by offensives or retreats, but by seasons changing beyond the wire. Summer heat settled heavily over the barracks, followed by cooler nights that hinted at autumn. And with each shift, the women felt themselves drifting further away from the people they had once been. War had already stripped them of certainty. But captivity, especially this strange, humane captivity, was reshaping their inner lives in quieter, more unsettling ways. Without constant danger, the mind turned inward, replaying decisions, moments of silence, questions never asked. Many of the women began to realize that survival had once excused everything. But reflection demanded accountability, even if that accountability was deeply personal rather than judicial. American officers noticed changes as well. The German women were no longer simply compliant prisoners. They were thinkers, organizers, educators within the limits allowed to them. Informal classes emerged in the camps, language lessons, anatomy refreshers, even discussions about public health and post-war reconstruction. Knowledge became a form of resistance against despair. If their country lay in ruins, perhaps rebuilding would require minds as much as bricks. The Americans did not discourage this. In fact, some quietly supported it, believing that a stable Germany would ultimately depend on people who understood discipline, compassion, and responsibility rather than blind obedience. Interactions between guards and prisoners grew more complex, though never careless. There were still rules, boundaries that could not be crossed, but within those limits respect deepened. Guards began greeting the women by name rather than number. Small courtesies, an extra blanket during cold nights, permission to tend a small garden patch, access to additional medical supplies were granted not out of sentimentality, but recognition. Trust once established became difficult to revoke. For the women, this trust carried its own burden. They felt an obligation not to betray it, to behave in ways that justified the belief placed in them, even as prisoners. Not all reactions were positive. Some women struggled with resentment, feeling that this kindness came too late to matter. Where had such humanity been when cities burned, when hospitals collapsed under bombing raids, when evacuation trains overflowed with the wounded? Others felt guilt so intense it bordered on self-punishment. Why should they be safe, fed, and respected while civilians back home scavenged among ruins? Survivors' guilt followed them relentlessly, turning comfort into accusation. The Americans could provide food and structure, but they could not silence the voices inside the women's minds. News from Europe grew clearer as months passed. Reports of devastation were no longer vague rumors but documented realities. Entire neighborhoods erased, infrastructure crippled, medical systems overwhelmed. For nurses trained to respond to crisis, the knowledge was agonizing. They wanted to help, to return, to apply their skills where they were most needed. Yet they remained behind the wire, suspended between a past that could not be undone and a future that had not yet begun. Some petitioned camp authorities, asking to be repatriated sooner, even offering to assist Allied humanitarian efforts in Germany. These requests were noted, discussed, and often delayed, not out of malice, but logistics and politics. The war might have ended, but peace was still fragile. In this waiting period, identity became the central struggle. Were they prisoners? Victims? Professionals? Complicit witnesses? The phrase, "you're still nurses," echoed differently now. At first it had felt like mercy. Now it felt like a mirror, reflecting questions they could not avoid. What did it mean to be a nurse in a war that had so thoroughly devalued life? Could professionalism absolve silence? Could compassion coexist with obedience to a criminal state? These questions had no easy answers, and the camps became spaces where such dilemmas were lived rather than debated. Some women recorded their thoughts in diaries, pages filled with contradictions, gratitude beside anger, shame beside pride. Others avoided writing altogether, fearing that words would solidify emotions they barely understood. Friendships deepened under shared uncertainty. Women who might never have spoken, beyond duty during the war, now relied on one another for emotional survival. Hierarchies softened, rank mattered less than resilience. In caring for each other, they rediscovered fragments of themselves that had been buried under uniforms and regulations. The Americans, too, were changing. Many soldiers had entered the war with simplified notions of good and evil, reinforced by propaganda necessary for combat, living alongside enemy women who laughed, grieved, healed, and questioned, challenged those narratives. Some guards later admitted that these encounters permanently altered how they viewed the war and its aftermath. Victory no longer felt pure, but neither did it feel empty. It carried responsibility to remember, to rebuild, and to avoid repeating what had brought the world to ruin. As repatriation plans slowly took shape, anticipation mixed with dread. Returning home meant freedom, but also confrontation with destroyed landscapes, with judgment from neighbors, with internal reckonings that captivity had only begun. The camps, paradoxically, had become places of safety, structured and predictable. Leaving them meant stepping into uncertainty far greater than barbed wire. For some women, the thought was terrifying. For others, it was the only thing that kept them going. When lists of names were finally posted announcing upcoming departures, reactions varied wildly. Tears of relief stood beside silent panic. Some women stared at the lists for long minutes, unable to move, as if confirmation of return made the past suddenly heavier. Others immediately began preparing, packing few belongings, rehearsing explanations they might have to give upon arrival. The Americans handled these moments with restrained empathy, aware that release did not mean closure. The night before departure, conversations stretched late into the dark. Promises were made to write, to remember, to tell the truth if anyone ever asked. No one knew how much truth the world would be willing to hear, but among these women at least, there was an unspoken agreement. Whatever awaited them beyond the camp gates, they would carry forward the part of themselves that captivity had unexpectedly preserved, the belief that humanity could survive even within war's machinery. Departure days arrived without ceremony. stripped of drama as if the camps themselves understood that spectacle would cheapen what was happening. Trucks rolled in early, engines idling softly while morning mist still clung to the ground, and the women assembled with bags far lighter than the weight they carried inside. There were no speeches, no flags raised or lowered, just names called one by one and quiet, acknowledgments exchanged between prisoners and guards who had come to know each other in ways neither side had expected. Some of the women avoided eye contact, fearing that a single look might break the composure they had worked so hard to maintain. Others offered brief nods, gestures of mutual recognition that required no words. The war had taken many things from all of them, but it had also left behind this strange, fragile understanding. The journey back across the Atlantic felt nothing like their arrival. Then fear had dominated every thought, the ocean itself seeming like a barrier between survival and whatever punishment awaited. Now the fear was different, less immediate, more existential. What would Germany look like? What would people expect from them? Would they be welcomed as professionals needed for reconstruction, or shunned as reminders of a regime everyone wanted to forget? The women spoke quietly among themselves, sharing rumors and fragments of information picked up from guards and newspapers. No one had a clear picture. Uncertainty became the only certainty. Upon arrival in Europe, reality struck with brutal clarity. Ports were damaged, cities hollowed out, infrastructure strained beyond recognition. The contrast between American order and European devastation was overwhelming. For some women, the shock triggered a deep sense of dislocation, as if they no longer belonged fully to either world. America had been captivity, yet also stability. Germany was home, yet broken and unpredictable. The skills that had defined their identities, organization, care, efficiency, were suddenly needed everywhere. But resources were scarce and authority structures chaotic. The women stepped into this void carrying not only medical training, but the psychological imprint of their captivity. History often prefers clean endings. It likes victories that feel pure, defeats that feel deserved, and stories that fit neatly into moral boxes. But the experience of the German women prisoners of war in America refuses that simplicity. There were no parades when they arrived, no dramatic trials within the camps, no moments that could easily be turned into propaganda without losing the truth. Instead, there was something far more unsettling and far more powerful, ordinary. Humanity sustained in an extraordinary time of violence, behind barbed wire in a land far from home. These women discovered that captivity did not automatically mean the death of dignity, and that enemies did not always behave as monsters. The words, "You're still nurses," were never written into treaties or carved into monuments, yet they carried a weight that outlived the war itself. They reminded these women that identity could survive collapse, that profession and conscience did not vanish when uniforms were stripped away. In recognizing them as healers rather than symbols of a defeated enemy, America forced them to confront a difficult truth. Humanity, once acknowledged, cannot easily be denied again. That recognition became both a gift and a burden, because it demanded responsibility long after the war ended. When the women returned to a shattered Germany, they carried no medals and received little public acknowledgement. Their story unfolded quietly, in hospital wards rebuilt from rubble, in classrooms where ethics were taught alongside anatomy, in private reflections that rarely found their way into official history. Yet their influence endured in subtle ways. They became living proof that war does not erase moral choice, only tests it under unbearable pressure. They understood that compassion shown by an enemy could become a mirror, forcing one to examine personal silence, obedience, and courage with brutal honesty. For the Americans who guarded them, the experience also left an imprint. Many would later struggle to explain how victory felt, heavier after witnessing the humanity of those they had been trained to hate. The war had been necessary, perhaps unavoidable, but it had not been simple. In treating enemy women with dignity, they had preserved something fragile and essential, proof that even total war did not have to consume every moral boundary. That choice mattered, not because it erased suffering, but because it prevented suffering from becoming the only language left. Today, as history is retold and retold again, the story of these women stands as a quiet challenge. It asks uncomfortable questions. What does it mean to remain human when systems demand dehumanization? How much responsibility does an individual carry within a destructive ideology? And perhaps most importantly, what kind of future becomes possible when enemies choose recognition over revenge? These questions do not belong only to the past. They echo forward into every conflict that follows. The German women who heard those words, "You're still nurses," never forgot them. Not because they erased guilt or suffering, but because they affirmed something war tries hardest to destroy: the idea that identity, conscience, and compassion can survive even the darkest chapters of human history. And in that survival lies a lesson far more enduring than any battlefield victory: the reminder that how we treat our enemies may ultimately define who we become when the war is finally over. Thanks for watching.